We're going live, and okay, we're live now. I do want to wait another couple minutes, or maybe 90 seconds, so a few others can join the live hangout. Here's John coming on. Hey, John.
Hey.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna just do a brief, couple brief announcements, and then we'll get started. I want to show you some of the mountains here in Colorado. Can you see the mountains?
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's like the high desert, and it's quite nice. Okay, so all right, we have plenty of viewers on YouTube now, and we're going to get started for today's class. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Global Center for Advanced Studies, GCAS. I'm Creston Davis, and it's a pleasure to be starting this school up with everyone, and we're sort of making a lot of progress with not just on the student level or researchers, but also faculty are in touch with me asking me about how they can participate and join us, and it's been really a great time. We're sort of in the middle of a transitional period in a way. We're now organizing funds for launching our school proper, and it's been a year since I incorporated this school as a nonprofit, and it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of researchers or students, as we call them, or we call them researchers, have been really helping us as we form the foundations and really get off on the right foot. So it's been a great, amazing thing to be part of, a movement to be part of, and so I'd like to welcome everybody for today's seminar, The Introduction to Lacanian Structures. Today is our third class. A few brief announcements. First, I'd like to announce that we do need a logo, and what we're going to do is we're going to do a public contest of sorts for a logo, and so you can submit your logo through our Facebook design and whatever you would like, and our student union or researchers union will evaluate all submissions and then choose 5 from which to they'll choose 5 finalists, and then we'll have a public election as to what our logo will be, and that'll be really fantastic. So okay, so that's one announcement. Another couple announcements. I've been in touch with Jean-Luc Nancy, who is very interested in teaching a class on the image for GCAS. This will be coming up in the springtime or maybe even late fall. So we have plenty of classes that are on our website. Our website is just new, and it's in great need of updating, and a lot of content needs to be added to the website. But you can now register for all the classes we have for the fall, and I encourage you to do that. We do have programs in place, so you can receive certificates and diplomas through our various programs or institutes. For example, our Institute in Critical Philosophy, Institute in Critical Theology, our Institute of Art and Media Studies, Global Studies. So we have a number of policy studies. You can do a master's degree with us in Cultural Studies through our partnering institute in Europe, which is accredited in the Bologna Treatise or the Bologna process, which is the same accreditation agency that Oxford and Cambridge and University of Paris are part of. So I'd like to encourage you to, if you are interested in that, I think 4 students are already signed up for that master's degree, and that will be kicking off in the fall as well. So okay, I think that's it for all the introductory comments and what I need to communicate. I'm just really excited about how we're doing this, and we're doing this in a really, I think, great organized way. I'd like to thank Andrew I'd like to thank Michael for all the work that they're doing and others who are participating, James, in constructing and organizing on various levels. So thank you so much. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to pass the baton on to our professors from Brooklyn. So why don't you guys take it away? Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you. Hello guys, so we're going to be talking about Lacanian structures. Today is the third class. First class we spoke about mirror stage. Second class we spoke about the graph of desire. So we basically spoke in the first class how the personality structure starts forming. And in the graph of desire we showed how it can be complete in terms of kind of all stages of socialization into cultural space, and now and chronologically, kind of like mirror stage was Lacan before I would say 60s, or 50s even, and graph of desire was 50s and beginning of 60s, and now in 60s Lacan. Specifically in 63, gets completely excommunicated from the International Psychoanalytic Association. And so what he does basically is start working on the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. And so what's important for him in four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis is that he's boiling down the psychoanalytic theory to concepts that are not, repeating the same phenomena, and he's doing this in order to get back at the psychoanalytic establishment of the period, which is basically, in his perspective, hijacking the psychoanalytic cause and using Freud's theory and concepts to create a discourse that is radically not the one that Freud, in Lacan's point of view, intended. And he's really doing this by boiling this down to four fundamental concepts. And he is using the themes in these in this process a lot, and the themes are basically these symbols that stand in for what we otherwise would use language for, well, whatever language we're using. But what's special about the themes is that, actually, give me a second. Okay, sorry. We did some rearrangement in terms of Andy is also in the process of responding in his lecture to my lecture, so he's working on his presentation right now. And going back to the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, I want to show you basically back to the diagram. Okay, great. Okay, so I hope you can see this. Please let me know if you don't. I'm following you guys on Facebook, and you can always pop into the chat. The chat is open, and there is space in the Hangout where you can come in and ask questions through the class, really. Okay. So as we see, and as we spoke from the last class, the divided subject is produced by encounter of the other via symbolic, and this other is both the superego, ego ideal, and the ideal ego, the big other, which together they work on two different levels, as we showed in the graph of desire. And so we see basically four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis here. We see the barred subject, we see object A, we see the S1, and we see, which is the master signifier, the signifier that ties together the signifying chain, the signifier that also symbolizes the limitation of the signifying chain, and by this binds it together, and all the other signifiers are in Lacan's methemes symbolized as S2. So, when Lacan introduces his four discourses, is right after the events in Paris in 1968, and he was actually offered to teach this seminar at Université de Paris 8, which was, space actually provided to him by Foucault. And so, yeah, I also have this here. It says, paradoxically, enjoyment itself is in its innermost status something imposed, ordered. When we enjoy, we always follow a certain injuncture. So, great. So here, going back to kind of the idea of subject being divided on symbolizer and symbolized, we can kind of see like how there is this symbolic word tree, and then we have the image of the tree, which is unable to be fully symbolized into. Can we all mute ourselves? I see. Thank you, Doe. Okay, so yeah, we can look at the tree as an example of symbolizer and symbolized, and the divide that it produces. So Lacan basically says that our psyche is also divided into parts as a result of our internalization of symbolic order. And so I shared a link on the group wall on Facebook, and I would prefer that you open that and have that image handy somewhere, because I'm going to return to video. Okay, great. Okay, so basically, if we look at that image with four discourses, we see on the upper central part, Master's Discourse. This is called Master's Discourse. And so we see there that there are two sides to it, right? The left side S1 and then part subject, and the right side S2 and object A. So this is the way Lacan tries to symbolize the social link. So he is already saying that once we're socialized into the mirror stage, the Oedipal stage, that we engage with the other. So the right side would be the other. We engage with the other to form the social link. And so the social link is also governed by the symbolic. And so we basically, I'll show you this slide too, just to so basically here we see there is an agent, there is a other. I specifically did not capitalize this this other as big other, because right now in the social link architecture, what matters is that it is the other to the agent who is the source of the social link. So in the social link, agent is really the actor who produces speech, and this is moment when the speech is connected to language in the social communication. And of course, as we can see on the image that I shared with you on Facebook group wall, it is its quality is impossibility. So impossibility is basically this quality of symbolic communication that cannot fully communicate the intended meaning of the speech. So there's a radical disjuncture between enunciated and enunciation, according to Lacan. And however, every discourse produces a product, which is a product of this discourse, right? There is always a certain product in a communication process that we will be discussing, specifically how it plays a role in each particular discourse. And as far as there is impossibility in communication, in the social link, there is always the truth, something that is unable to be present in the speech in this particular discourse. So basically what we're seeing on the below the bar in this art structure is the, one could say, unconscious in many ways. Though the discourses themselves are unconscious, but the agent and the other meet themselves in the real world, and these are real people. And this is how Lacan uses his teaching now to exit the clinical and start talking about political, and apply this psychoanalytic concepts to what's going on in Paris of 1968. Okay, great. So first of all, as I showed you, there's a master's discourse that goes from the master signifier S1 towards S2. So master signifier S1 is not only the point de capiton of castration, it is also the signifier that stands above the law, that is something that one can only establish relationship of belief towards. So it's really signifying the ideology, the belief that is above the knowledge. S2 is knowledge. The knowledge as multiplicity of signifiers that are in relation to S1 in terms of being basically limited by it, and within that limitation given meaning to. And as we spoke last class, S1 establishes relationship between the meaning, the signifier, and the signifier. And so in the Master's Discourse, Lacan calls it Master's Discourse because he's talking about the importance of returning to Hegel. And Hegel's master-slave relationship. There's a question, impossibility is loosely equated to conscious, impotence loosely to unconscious. Right, loosely we could say that impossibility is the impossibility of consciousness and the conscious speech to be able to communicate to the other our intention, and the impotence is the impotence of the product of the discourse to meet the needs of the truth, which is not even present fully as an actor of the social link. So going back to the image that I shared with you, master signifier here is in the what one could say feudal or basic power relation to its slaves, to S2. So why is suddenly the big other identified with somebody who is submitting to the master? The reason is that Lacan says big other is knowledge. There is knowledge about how to satisfy this master and how to satisfy these commands that are coming from the master. And so we can see that the product of master's discourse is object A. So Lacan talks here about surplus of production in capitalist structure as equivalent to this product that is created as a result of S1, master signifier, ordering S2, the people, I would say, who possess the knowledge that is authorized and legitimized by the authority to produce something that master is lacking. Now, this is where the impotence of this discourse comes into play, because object I is unable to fill the void of the barred subject, who happens to be in the place of truth. As I showed you the structure of the Lacan's discourse, truth is the one that the speaking subject has to not include in the demand, because otherwise it will be incompatible with the position that the actor is occupying. And if we look at the master's discourse, we can see why S1 is incompatible with the lack of the barred subject that it stands in for. Because if the king would, for example, come out to his country, or if the ego will be the symbolization of the void in the subject of this barred subject, the subject barred by the symbolic, then it will not be able to establish that relationship between signifier and signified, and it will not be able to orient all the S2s towards itself. And in this master discourse, we kind of see the way ego in our psyche relates back to our big other, our unconscious, by giving it a place and at the same time demanding that there is certain production of object of pleasure or something beyond the pleasure, actually, to meet the demand of the desire, which cannot be inscribed into a demand, and this as such makes it impossible and therefore impotent, the whole process. However, we can see that there are not one but 4 discourses that Lacan introduces us to in his seminars at the period. And if you read the readings, the seminar 17 that I posted, you can see that there is a lot of opposition that Lacan is experiencing in his seminars. People are arguing with him. People are saying, who needs these structures? Aren't you just trying to inscribe another kind of a theory or teach us another theory from your position of authority? And isn't this basically same as the establishment that we students and people of 1968 Paris Cultural Revolution are rebelling against? Lacan answers this by offering 4 different discourses and offering 3 different alternatives to the master's discourse that the people were allegedly rioting against in the streets of Paris. So Lacan basically shows how structurally speaking, and once he has boiled down psychoanalytic theory to 4 fundamental concepts, one could see difference in discourses by reorientation of these fundamental concepts. And Lacan says that hysterics discourse, which is on the right, is different from university discourse, which is on the left, and from the analyst discourse, which is on the bottom. In hysterics discourse, the turn happens, you can see 90% reversion of the graph of the structure, where we get that barred subject that the master signifier was standing in for as an actor, referring to the master signifier. And why is this hysteric? Because this is what basically the discourse that Freud noticed and used to build his psychoanalytic theory on. This is a discourse of the body, in a way, because one could say that the part subject is, in this case, rebelling against the symbolic order. So we see that the symbolic order is completely on the side of the other, and we get the part subject coming out of not the authority at this point, but out of lack, and referring to the symbolic authority. This lack is what the symbolic authority cannot inscribe. And this is that place that corresponds with the missing object A. However, in this discourse, object A does not stand in the place of the actor, because object A is the desire of this body, desire that is not being symbolized into demand, desire that is not establishing direct link with the symbolic in here, but is not represented in the conscious part, so to say, of the structure. Is not represented in the structure or on a conscious level, because it is that that is the truth of this discourse, that in reality hysteric has desire, that besides from figuring out its relation to the symbolic order, it has its own desire, which is not necessarily mediated completely by the symbolic order. But what hysteric is missing is exactly this truth. And while missing this truth, hysteric is basically demanding from the authority that it demand from itself better. So hysteric is basically deconstructing the authority, and oftentimes we see this in the symptom of hysteric, bodily symptom oftentimes, when body is rebelling against symbolic conflict within itself via symbolic symptom. So the symptoms in this discourse, the psychosomatic symptoms, are also radically symbolic for Lacan, as they are for Freud. As we see, the Barth subject is demanding from the authority that it basically demand back better, and that it govern better. So, as Lacan says, if I'm not mistaken, the hysteric reigns and lets govern. So, in a way, a lot of the postmodern deconstruction and rebellion against authority, especially the traditional authority, is along this discourse. What's problematic about this rebellion in the eyes of Lacan is that it does not claim to be positioning its desire as the source of the subversion of the master's discourse. It, however, argues with the completeness of the authority, and as far as the authority is symbolic, and as far as symbolic can never fully encompass and symbolize the reality, the real. Therefore, this discourse can go on forever. And the goal of such discourse, the product of it, as we can see, is exactly that big other, the knowledge, the multitude, kind of, that one symbolic master signifier is unable to encompass and to fully represent in its governance. So if we want to think about this from the perspective of political dynamic, we can see in democratic countries a lot of protests against specific things that the population does not like about the governance. And what the goal of many of such protests are correction, in a way, of this governance. So, in the idea of this hysterics discourse taken onto the political frame of demonstrating, for example, or even rebelling against the authorities, is that it shows that what we have here is functioning on the symbolic side of things again, and ignoring that real, the desire, or the what then especially Zizek develops into the idea of the difference, the real difference. And this real difference is the one that differentiates classes in the society among each other. So really what in the hysterics discourse is missing is the acceptance of the radical division an antagonism that exists in the society, within the society, which is the class difference. And hysteric rebels against the authority while ignoring this class difference. Otherwise, this would be different. And I'll explain how. We see university discourse on the left. And we see that Lacan starts his seminar with university discourse and makes very important statement that in the present time, master's discourse is not presented to us in the way that Hegel spoke about feudal structure of exploitation. It's presented to us in a 90-degree subverted way. The other direction now, as we can see, the hysteric, everything moved one way, and with the university, everything moved the other way. But hysteric and university share the same strong conviction in the superiority of S2 knowledge over the belief. We see that in university discourse when, as actor now, we see that S2, which is a product of the hysterics discourse. So in university discourse, we see how find myself here. In university discourse, we see how university that possesses this knowledge is referring to the other, which for the university is the student, as object A, the object of its desire. University, the discourse claims to be the egalitarian discourse. It claims to be absent from the ideology, from the master signifier, from the ultimate authority of one. And it claims to be desiring this object of its desire, which is the student, or if the university discourse is perceived as a form of governance, as the society, the people, as the object of its knowledge. So what such authority claims is that it possesses the objective knowledge of the society, and that the society is the object of its desire that it's interested in benefiting. However, we see that there cannot be, and we already spoke about this in a graph of desire, when basically desire went on springing like a fountain out of the structure into the phantasmatic, and in case of no proper Oedipal stage, psychotic discourse. So in this case, we do not have a psychotic discourse because there is division between conscious and unconscious. However, we see that the unconscious here is big other in the place of the actor. So this is why this also is called perverts discourse. This is a discourse of somebody who believes that with the knowledge they have, they can objectively engage with the object of their desire, and therefore have direct satisfaction of their needs through the symbolic order. Why is that problematic? Because we spoke so much about objectivity and knowledge and big other being itself as a whole based on the fundamental misrecognition of its incompleteness. And so in order to establish this relation to its incompleteness, S2 needs S1. And S1 is behind it, as university needs ideology that ties it together into a bureaucratic structure. So what we're looking at here is the bureaucratic structure that is claiming the objectivity of its intentions towards the common folk. However, what it ignores is that ideology that is radically behind it. Now, if we look at the picture that I shared with you before, this one, we see that there is a fourth discourse. And if we look at the two discourses of the university and hysteric, we see that they are both still within the symbolic reality. In hysteric's case, the real of object I is repressed. In case of university's discourse, reality and real is perceived as completely inscribable into the symbolic order and submitted to the symbolic order. And therefore, in both of these discourses, we see a transformation of the power dynamic in the master's discourse that is also, in a way, structure of our personality, but not in a complete way. So if we look at the 180% reversal of the master's discourse, we see that the object are the product of the hegemony of the ideology, which is also, as I said, the smallest difference, class difference, or object I. And you see here how, with boiling things down to four concepts, Lacan is really showing how a lot of words we use are interchangeable, and how words, because of their history and political weight and the theories that stand behind them and the common meaning that they have, are very obscuring to our discourses and to our conversation and to the transmission of psychoanalytic knowledge and to, therefore, the formation of psychoanalytic organizations and training. So it's an interesting fact that Lacan, with this, is rebelling against the obscurantism within the psychoanalytic community, and then he gets blamed by people like Noam Chomsky for being obscurantist. That's a really big dilemma for me that I have not understood, how somebody who has put so much work in de-obscuring the psychoanalytic theory can be considered an obscurantist poser in the Anglo-Saxon academic world. However, when Lacan is talking about the university discourse, he's talking about the university in the Western world. He's talking about the biopolitics of the expert rule in the liberal democratic political systems that basically treat their populace as objects of their best knowledge. So, in a way, this is the most sublime of the hysterics, going back to Hegel, which claims to have deconstructed this big other to the fullest and possess that objective knowledge that the big other was hiding. However, if you look at the master's discourse, we see that belief and limitation to our symbolic is essential to inscribing and forming the chain of signification and the big other as a complete. So, as the bureaucratic system of the university needs this completeness in order to function as the source of the social link, it inevitably needs the ideology, and the ideology is always there. Any questions so far?
This is great. Thank you so much, Vako.
No problem. Sure. Yeah, so there's a question, where do I see belief in the discourse? Yeah, it's S1, right? So if we look at the graph of desire, if we think about the graph of desire as example of the moment when the S1 even appears in the structure, which otherwise is governed by S2, the big other, the structure that was formed in the mirror stage, which establishes pretty direct connection with the symbolic, between the symbolic and the real, because the child thinks, oh, well, hey, this is what I asked for and I get it. If I don't ask for it correctly, I'm just going to correct how long I'm going to cry for, how loud I'm going to yell for, and how much I'm going to entertain my caregiver, and then my demand is going to be satisfied. However, with the growth, the child is introduced to radical impossibility of this communication. And so then, in order to limit the discourse and to inscribe this limitation, we have identification with the master signifier, which is, as Lacan says, the name. It doesn't have the name to have to be a name of the father. It has to be the symbolic inscription of the ego. So I am a Democrat. I am working class. I am white. I am black. This is an identity that stands above the big other and basically stands in for whatever that big other is unable to symbolize. So it's a symbolization of the rational, and that is belief. And that is Lacan's take also on religion, as I understand. But that's really a topic of a different conversation. So that's S1, and S2 is the multitude of symbolic signifiers tied together with language that otherwise would be in what we experience when we have dissolution of the ego. Multitude of multitudes and experience of multiplicity of drives, which are all already symbolic, as we saw in the graph of desire. Drives are a product of demand. Demand to see, demand to hear, demand to experience, taste. These drives are already symbolic and they're already pulling in different directions. As far as the symbolic structure that we have internalized is not necessarily complete. And it's great that it's not complete because it has to be the system that is adequate to the real, which is also never completely presenting itself in the symbolic structure, and therefore the symbolic structure itself has all rights not to be complete. However, this incompleteness then has to be somehow symbolized. And this is what we see with the formation of belief, with the formation of our relation to our part subject, to that void, that's something that stands in the place of the void, and the void being, as we saw from the Venn diagram I showed you, is a product of impossibility of symbolization of the body. So we, in the discourse, have complete subversion of the master's discourse when we bring that object A that S1 was supposed to basically stand in for, into the place of the actor. And as such, it is not referring to the knowledge as to the unconscious as to, or to our ego S1 and belief. It is referring directly to that lack that produces this object A, that lack in the subject, that lack that the subject actually itself is. So in analytic discourse, we see analysts fully taking responsibility, or at least attempting to fully take responsibility for one's own desire. And that's the desire of the analyst. And that's the object of desire. A is standing in exactly to symbolize that desire towards hearing what there is unsymbolized in the subject that is trying to make itself heard through the symbolic. And by doing this, by referring directly to that void, analyst is antagonizing the relationship between the subject and its S1, its ego, its belief system, its core beliefs, its relation to the world. And by doing this, we can see that in analyst discourse, the product of the discourse is the new way of relating between consciousness and unconscious. So this is a après-coup formation, after the coup. I like this Lacanian concept. Formation of a new ego, new belief system, new relation to knowledge as well. Is it in analyst discourse able to fully meet even the knowledge that the analyst is coming out of? Because definitely analyst desire is founded into the knowledge. And we see that in the position of truth, that there is that fundamental knowledge which is necessary for the analyst to be able to direct its social link towards the barred subject. So we need to know in the structure where this barred subject is. This knowledge the knowledge of the structure is itself described in the analyst's discourse as S2 in the place of truth under the object A. And that is completely necessary for the analytic process. However, as we can see, and many have said, and Lacan has not disputed this, this means that the symbolic is always present behind the formation of any social link, and analysts therefore is very easy to fall prey for becoming a university discourse or master's discourse by identifying with that new belief system that it has formed completely. And this is what we see happening in many parts of psychoanalytic movement that is becoming increasingly empiricist, right? So we can kind of say that empiricists can be identified with the university discourse. Then we could say that deconstructionists could be identified with the hysterics discourse, and we could say that people who are, more traditional can be identified with the master's discourse in the patriarchal mode of social link. However, analyst discourse is radically different from all three of these discourses. It is recognizing object A as fundamental to all the discourses and all these transformations among the discourses and within the discourses, and it is positioning that real as the place from which the actors should carry out. And this position is the position that is radically opposed to all forms of symbolic authority. And symbolic authority, sorry, got it. I meant. No, I mean, I'm happy to take all questions, please. Feel free. This is, as you're hearing, already very applied. I'm talking about kings, governments, universities, psychoanalytic institutes. I'm talking about organization, and this is extremely practical part when we already go through the application of the Lacan's theory, not only to the developmental psychology or to the structure of personality, but to more broad social processes. And, I've not been doing this. Andy has been doing this more in his part of the class, but here is where Lacan himself, with these structures, gets to the point of really trying to get back at the social processes that are, in a way, ignoring and marginalizing his discourse. There's a question? So, yeah, there's a question, how does deconstruction become hysteric or university? Is it not supposed to be organized around Lec? Something like object A. So there are different types of Lec and loss. So in hysterics discourse, what's not present for the hysteric is the proper symbolic authority. So there is a certain incompleteness in the symbolic authority that is being challenged. Now, if we're talking about the position from which hysteric is challenging this is a position of that is like, for example, hysteric, you know, unfortunately, we need to go back to Freud's examples. Just give me a second. Sorry. Never mind. Freud's example is a woman who is being hysteric in a patriarchal society where a man is trying to order her around via this symbolic rule that is completely submitted to the patriarchal S1. In this case, there are different ways of rebelling against this S1. One way is to figure out what you want yourself. Another way is to find irregularities in that rule and challenge those irregularities within the symbolic. So object A is not irregularity among the symbolic. The Barth subject is representing that. And believing that S2 can fill in that irregularity or illogicity, right? So that's what deconstruction really does. It points out the illogical, irrational elements of the symbolic rule. And what we're seeing here is different from analyst discourse, in which it's not the irregularities in symbolic that are being pointed out by analyst desire in analyst discourse. It is that structural lack itself within the subject, that radical void that is being exposed with the desires and multiplicity that stem out of it. Oh, great. So there's a question. I've had many people ponder the question of analyst discourse in culture. How does it work here? How could it work here, etc. But I have some doubts about this liberatory potential outside of the clinic. In the most social interactions are not promised on free association, and I can quite see how the constitution of social link in a way that the analyst does in the clinic, if most of what the analyst says is an punctuation of what the social or other had already said or slipped, etc. Your thoughts about how analyst discourse could function outside of clinic without turning into a perverse discourse? That's a great question. Thank you. So analyst discourse is inevitably linked to perverse discourse and perversion of the symbolic in terms of its own use onto itself. And just a second.
Is Lacan at the door? He's always at the door. Hey, I asked Vako if Lacan was at the door.
Yeah, I heard you. Yeah, this was Lacan at the door.
And then Andrew Steinberg goes, always. He's always at the door.
Well, in reality, as you saw, this was another Andrew.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we're seeing here is the analyst discourse applied to this, the social and political outside of clinic in Zizek's works, in Badiou's works, and here it really becomes the discourse of revolution. It becomes that discourse that puts that radical class divide that Zizek talks so much about in his parallax view as the source of the formation of the social link of revolution. And so analysts punctuating and sitting there behind the couch in the clinic is effectively helping stage that revolution within the subject. But however, this is impossible, and Lacan talks about analyst discourse being kind of an expansion of the university discourse when it goes beyond it in a way to allow for the inscription of that object R that is not inscribed yet, and that we can find in the antagonism between the subjects void and the ego, S1. So in this way, Lacan is basically saying that your revolution is not revolutionary enough to the students of 1968 France by claiming that they're not listening to their own, I guess, desire enough, and to the need for the master that we see in the hysterics discourse. They're not listening to that subject that is observing the S1. So here we are seeing analyst discourse as what could be said, called negation of the negation provided by the hysterics discourse of the S1. So in this case, analyst negates that barred subject itself and shows how this barred subject is fundamentally barred by the symbolic description itself, and how in the movement, if we want to be building a revolutionary movement by any chance, the listening to our desire has to be fundamental in forming new organization, whatever it can be. Any other questions? We're going to go on a 15-minute break, but I'm going to be still taking the questions and answering them, so we can continue this interactive before Andy steps in. Okay? Thank you.
Thanks, Mako. Okay.
Yeah, 15 minutes. Thank you. Okay, this, a few minutes? I think I'll have the case. It's there.
Does Preston usher us in?
Huh? No.
Preston.
Hello, I'm here.
Oh, Preston, do we indicate the break is over?
You're already on there. You can press the big unplug.
What's the question?
Do you introduce me, or do I just pop
No,
in?
we could just come back off the break and whenever you feel comfortable starting.
All right, Ruth, I'm ready.
Okay, great. Just just to click on your video and we're good to go. Okay, there you are. How's things? By the way, how's things in Brooklyn? I hear it's humid.
Real thing.
Yeah.
It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I just took a walk around the block. It is a little bit humid, but it's a gorgeous day. Good day for bike riding.
Oh, that's amazing. It's a great summer, actually.
I have no complaints.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, I'm hoping that, by the way, you'd be willing to, you and Vaco at some time, be willing to continue teaching as we grow and be part of GCAS in some ways, at a core level.
Well, let's talk about that then.
Okay, sounds good. All right, take it away, Andrew.
Welcome back. Glad you're here. I don't know how many of you were with us last time, so I'm going to go over a little bit of where I left off then, just so that there's a little bit of continuity, both for the people that were here and those who are new. We left off talking about Hegel's first negation. The relationship between this is what was explained at the end of last session. The relationship between Hegel's first negation and the evolution of the mirror stage is crossing the threshold between the real or social self and the socially abducted and abdicated self. This relates back to the expanded Lacanian structure of the mirror stage that I've developed in abduction topology. But I think that is really relevant to what we're doing here. One of the things that Vakho is doing is explaining, I think, what, Lacanian diagrams can be sometimes Arcanian. And I think he's done a great job of explaining those and how they fit into the analytic structure of this, of Lacanian psychology. But also, when we think about what Lacan did for Freud, now it's time for all of us, I think, to do the same for Lacan. All the little and big ways that we can. So by expanding the concatenation of the mirror stage from the ideal and the real and placing the stage before that, which is the zero I, or the non-being stage, and then after that, after the social stage, a state of abduction, or the Hegel's first negation, which I'll explain in a second. What we're doing really is a service to Lacan. We're bringing Lacan into what I think is becoming more and more and more important in our relationship to his ideas. If we look at, and I want to say one more thing about that. If we look at how Lacan became an extension of Freud and then completely transformed it through the structural mode, structuralism and post-structuralism, being wedged in between those two spots where he was. We see that Freud really was concerned about the individual psychology of his day, let's say before 1900, particularly the psychology of Adler, who was really the parent of individual psychology. Then Freud takes that to the next step and universalizes it, but on the individual level. And then we get to Lacan, who had a long run. So we can't really characterize one period of his discourse as characterizing all of his work and all of his influence and exposure. However, he's gone, so we can make some generalizations about him and his work. One of those generalizations is that he brought Freudian psychology into domains where it just did not exist in Freud. Maybe we get a little bit of a hint of it in Civilization and its Discontents, where Freud starts to focus more on civilization than on the individual. But then once again, civilization is a huge abstract concept. With Lacan, we start to get some focus on some specific aspects of civilization, one of which is politics. And a subset of politics, even more specific, is Marxist or Marxian politics. That's just an example. I'm not going to go into that right now. So, what are we doing now with Lacan? Do we want to make this entirely historical retrospective? Do we want to maintain this seminar that we're having here now as a historical exploration? Do we want this to be an introductory course to Lacan? Look, there is no such thing as an introductory course to Lacan, except reading his work, reading a plea, and starting your long journey through the seminars is really the only, you can leave that open, is really your only possible legitimate introduction to his ideas. So I don't think that you can possibly have an introductory course like that. If you do see one, don't take it, because that means that what you're going to be getting is the university discourse. Lacan cannot be taught under the voice of the university discourse. So that means that you must go back to the primary text, or you must find individuals, let's say Slavoj Žižek is probably a good example, it's not the only one, or Alain Badiou, who are more than, they understand what the university discourse is, and they're fully capable of it, and they are attached to universities, and they discourse in universities, but they are not proponents, they are not evangelists for the university discourse. Quite the opposite, they're evangelists against the university discourse. And the way they do that is they are themselves philosophers. And so what we're doing here you're doing and I'm doing, because you have your own ideas and I have my own ideas, is expanding upon or developing or reapplying Lacanian ideas to what's relevant to us right now in 2014. And I think one of the most, certainly, to me, what's most important right now in 2014 is propaganda. Propaganda wasn't so much of as much of an issue at certain points in history, because we can say that, let's say, the university discourse is a form of propaganda, certainly. But to get it, you must be in the university. Certainly in Lacan's day, and let's say in the first half of the 20th century, to get the university discourse, you had to be one of those elites that could actually get into the university. Well, those days are gone. The university discourse floods into the mass media in various guises, just as Christianity, the Christian discourse, flooded into all nooks and crannies of Western civilization through the book. It's no accident that the first book that was printed with movable type in 1449 was a Bible. It inaugurated the whole epoch of the Christian discourse and Christian propaganda. Well, those days are gone too. So what we have now, partially, is the academic discourse flooding through, filtered, of course, through the mass media. So that means that we have to really take Lacan's sort of transitional psychology, where he was looking at not just the individual or the civilization, as Freud was doing in the very end. Civilization is his last book, appropriately. So I think one of the areas that we can apply it, no, it doesn't have to be with the analysis. And certainly that's a place to apply it, but I think that we can, and we can take the example of people like, let's say, Alain Badiou, particularly in the political activist realm, and Slavoj Žižek in terms of being a great media critic, and amongst other things, social critic, media critic, etc. So those are all applications of what we can do at the time. But today I'm really going to be concerned particularly with discourse in general. And of course, the subtitle of abduction topology is the psycholinguistics of discourse. The structures I'm interested in Lacan's work are really his work in psycholinguistics, which is often neglected, but is, I think, absolutely critical, particularly where he becomes, where he departs, let's say, off on the trail that was blazed by Ferdinand de Saussure. So Saussure, I would say, is a precursor to Lacan, in that he began to show that there is a structure to language. By doing so, he creates linguistics, which makes it possible for us to have psycholinguistics, by the way. Really, there was, before linguistics, there was philology. This is a bit of a history lesson. It's not my opinion. Before linguistics, which is really ushered in by the Swiss de Saussure, we have philology. So, what creates a Lacan at this point? Well, we take some Freud and we take some Saussure and we bring them together and we have psycholinguistics, which is absolutely critical to understanding all of Lacan's work. So, but that's my preamble here. I want to show you a diagram though and go right back to what I was talking about at the very beginning of this preamble, and that is Haeckel's first negation and what this means to us, because I didn't explain it yet. And if you were here last class, maybe you remember my explanation, but I think a diagram is going to help us out a little bit. Well, let me just get that on the screen right now.
There's a question about Lacanian anti-philosophy.
I'll get that.
Okay.
I just want to get this thing up there, and then I'll talk about that. Okay. Give me some props if you can see that.
Pull it out. Pull it out. Let me see if you see that.
Anybody see this?
No, no, no. Pull it out. Pull it out. Yes, they do. Once it's there, it's there.
Okay, good. All right, let me answer the question here. Let's see. Moving back to the clinic, would you say, all right, here's Doug's question. Moving back to the clinic, would you say the symptom is a way of tying the hidden desire symptom of the hysteric back into the symbolic?
Yeah.
Well, I think yes, but through language. Language in a special way that Lacan means it. And so we have to realize that when we talk about a common word such as language in the context of Lacanian thought, that we're really talking about a technical term. And in that case, if we link this to what I was just saying about Saussure, then we have Saussure's symbolic level, which he indicates just as Lacan with a capital S and a small s. So the small s, of course, is the thing. The capital S is the thing that's being represented, and the small s is the thing that is representing it. So hidden desire of the hysteric, well, in Freudian psychology, that really relates to the idea of cathexis. If we have a hidden desire, of course, is our cathexis, or our desire to grasp something and to hold something. Now, as I was saying in the last lecture, as soon as in the structures that we're talking about here, as soon as you grasp, if you're the hysteric and you're being driven by the engine of desire, and you finally get the thing that you desire and possess it, then you have made jouissance impossible. So that is really a formula for a pathological situation, which eventually leads the individual into, we hope, a clinical situation. I hope I've answered your question. So let's get back to this diagram here.
I remember the right word is incompatibility. That's how he describes the position of hysteric and desire. So it's basically incompatibility with the
Okay,
position.
so I presume you can all see this diagram. So, yeah, by the way, feel free to interrupt me. I won't necessarily get right to what you're saying, but I see what's going on here, and I will get to it. So let's look at this diagram. This gives us a decent structural approximation to what I was talking about at the very end of last lecture. So on the left side, we have the internal ego. And the shell around that, and by the way, we can look at this a little bit as set theory. On the shell of this, we have the alienating identity, which, if we're going to map it back to Freudian psychology, would be a kind of superego.
I just want to apologize. Yeah, I interpreted John's question, which is not necessarily about anti-philosophy. So you're going to read that whenever you have time. Back to you. It's up there. We missed it.
Oh, John's statement.
Yeah,
Okay.
John's question about.
Okay. So I was answering a question about a question. Okay. Well, we'll get to that too. So anyway, this diagram. Just think of it in Freudian terms. That we have the alienating identity, the superego. The superego consists of the not I, which we talked about at the very end of the last lecture. The not I in the three Lacanian orders is the real. What you see inside here, the internal self, is what I called the mélange of the symbolic and the imaginary, which gives the ego an interesting kind of position in this whole structure. It's not really there, because when you combine the imaginary with the symbolic, basically what you have is the mirror, not the thing. The thing that is the reflection of the thing, not the thing itself. On the other hand, we have the alienating identity, which belongs to the realm of the real. It also belongs to the designation of the superego. The greatest quality that we experience emotionally in our relationship between our ego, the I, and the not I, our superego, is guilt, according to Freud. Guilt isn't discussed a whole lot throughout Lacan, but it is when we're talking about the name of the Father. The name of the Father also belongs to this shell of the real, because the Father is another other. Father, we might say, is the subdominant other in the development of the I. Whoever's the immediate caregiver takes the, let's say, mother position. And we're just talking about these positions generically, A, B. It doesn't, there are no gender connections. We just have to use this terminology. So in that shell around the ego, the internal self, consisting of the imaginary and the symbolic, we have the realm of the real. And if we want to take it one step further, we could say, well, what's outside that shell of the alienating identity? Well, what's outside the alienating identity shell is the grand autre. It's the sum of all the stuff. It's the furniture of the world. And that is extremely important in the first negation. So then we have the thing that's obvious right in the middle, which is the speculum. And notice that the speculum is only going back and forth to the left side, not to the right side. If we take a look at what's on the right side, then it gets more interesting, and then this really gives us the transition into what I want to talk about today. The imago, and the misrecognized ideal. And what is the misrecognized ideal is méconnaissance, as opposed to connaissance. It's the méconnaissance. And what is the méconnaissance? It's our belief that we are understanding the world that we're in. We're understanding the furniture of the world. We're understanding the real. We're understanding the grand autre. But it is completely a projection of our own internal self, of the internal self on the left, which is being somewhat managed, kind of like, if you've ever been to a circus, it's like the lion tamer, and inside is the lion. In fact, if we drew one more circle inside the internal self, we'd have the id. The id is really the lion. But I don't want to go too far into augmenting this simple structure here. So, what does this have to do with what we're talking about today? Here's the point. As I said at the end of the last lecture, I'm going to go back to myself here. All right. What I said at the end of the last lecture is that in the first negation, in the abduction/abdication, because it's, what is it? It's voluntary hegemony. It's the hegemony of the real, the hegemony of the big other, which of course means the control of. And on the other hand, we have volunteered this hegemony. We have abdicated our sovereignty. And the key word here is sovereignty. We've abdicated it. And we'll get into why we might want to do this a little bit later. It's not because they tricked us or because they're bad or evil. We don't even know what they is. We don't even know what the discourse is. It's not the monster, and it's not the opposition. It's not the police. It's just the discourse. And because the discourse has a lot to do with being, our sense of being, and we have to admit, as is rather universally admitted in all of the discussions of being that you'll find from various philosophers, from Sartre all the way to Badiou, is that being has no attributes. Being has no attributes. The imago itself has no attributes either, because it is a projection of our own inner self, managed by the lion tamer, the superego. Please excuse the motorcycle out there. It'll be on in a minute. Traffic light. So, in the first negation, as the self has been developed through the real social stage and the previous two stages, now the ego has crystallized. One word that we can use to describe it. The ego has crystallized into this combination of the imaginary, the two orders, the imaginary and the symbolic. Then, at that point, the social, which Jean Baudrillard has such contempt for in the shadow of the silent majorities. And by the way, footnote here, where does that phrase silent majority come from? It comes from Homer's Odyssey. In the Odyssey, Homer refers to the silent majority as the dead in Hades. Not hell, Hades. So the dead are the silent majority in Homer, and that is a kind of metaphor for the masses in Baudrillard. So what happens in the first negation is that our sense of I inverts. In other words, everything that we thought was the social becomes who we are because we have abdicated our sovereignty. There are a lot of advantages to abdicating your sovereignty, and I highly recommend it. The first advantage of abdicating your sovereignty, your control over yourself, your sense of I, your inner self, is that you have a much, 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 much better relationship to the superego, to the alienating self. Because the alienating self is, after all, made up out of the big other. So your horrible, uncomfortable conflict with the name of the Father, your first big other, in your tiny little hazy infant world. And then as the Father becomes the ultimate, then as that happens, then your sense of guilt starts to go away, which is really nice. This really, really simple example, I, having been raised Catholic, and which is a perfect example actually, is that as a child you resist Catholicism. And the reason is you just universally resist it. Because it goes so, it's for grown-ups. There's Protestantism for kids. Ask any Mormon. But there is not Catholicism for kids. It is the opposite of the playground.
The Inquisition is
correct. It is the opposite of the playground. So all children resist this. But the price for resistance in this situation, is kill, crush, destroy, all resistance, is guilt. The guilt in the alienating self, the guilt in the superego. Because the superego is being developed and formed first by the name of the Father, and the name is more important than the Father, because it doesn't have to be a gender, remember that. It doesn't even have to be a thing, it could be a person, it could be the state, you could be a ward of the state. The state could be the name of the Father. So, let's get the gender issues out of here. These are all technical terms. Everything we're saying here is technical. It's not what you learn.
The feminists are coming.
Yeah, this is not what you learn in your family. But this is the only way we can talk about it. So, now that you have sort of equalized, you've reached equilibrium, and really it does have something to do with the idea of equilibrium, the second law of thermodynamics, we have struck an equilibrium with the granddaughter. And so as a result, the first advantage of the first negation is that the sense of guilt departs. And that reward in itself feels so good. We become a real Catholic. We go to church, we start practicing, we do this, we genuflect, we take communion, we go to confession, we say we're Catholics, we assume that identity on whatever level. No two individuals, even if they're members of the church or priests or cardinals, participate in the same level. Everyone participates on his or her own level. But now we're equalized and we feel comfortable in our religion, and usually that persists till death. That is, that in the first negation, there is just a kind of horizontal, linear, single track thread all through life, and then there's death. The other advantage of the first negation, when we negate the I, and we have the social inundate us and become our new I, is that we are now in a totally different relationship with the imago. Now the imago can, through its various tentacles, can become part of our experience of life. And this is what Baudrillard calls the simulacrum. I know that word is thrown around a lot, but what is it? It's of course, it's an imitation of something that doesn't exist. So suddenly we have this imago. Well, the imago needs a place to live. It needs a speculum because we cannot avoid the speculum. Way back at the beginning of the first lecture, I said that the speculum is our essential narcissism, strictly in the Freudian sense, which persists. Our narcissism persists through our life. It's not bad. Remember, we're not talking about bad and good. Everything I say here is a technical term. It's not the way it's bantered around in the press, the media. They're all technical terms. So narcissism is simply our original specular stage in the first stage of the 0I to I1. It's the I1 specular stage, where we don't know others exist, but we know we exist. We know we look into the mirror, or the literal mirror, or the mirror of the world, and we say, I am, but we don't really know others are out there, except in as much as they serve us. So the other great advantage is that suddenly now we can enjoy the mass media through what Umberto Eco calls hyper-reality. I know other people call it that, so let's not get into provenance arguments here. But Umberto Eco really owns it, particularly in his book, Adventures in Hyper-Reality. I highly recommend it. It's a 1 or 2 night read. It's hilarious. It's beautiful. He goes traveling across the country in his car, across the United States, visiting places like Dollywood and Epcot Center, and talks about how now he is in this world of hyper-reality. He can go to Epcot Center and go to Turkey or China. But these are simulacra of a China, of a Turkey that does not exist. Just for instance, I don't know when the last time you went to a really bad neighborhood Chinese restaurant, but I suggest do it tonight. And then think about this as you're eating this food. It is not Chinese food. I lived in China for a year. I know I've not once, ever, and I've gone to many Chinese restaurants, ever had a single thing that I had in China. And I lived there for a year, breakfast, lunch, and dinner Chinese food. So what we have here is a simulacrum of Chinese food. It's Chinese food that doesn't exist. But it's not really involved in the mass media, so let's keep that out of it, except when you order something on seamless.com.
It is actually a simulacrum of a simulacrum because the Chinese food is already a simulacrum of what Chinese people cook at home, because that's the simulacrum of all the commercial food we eat.
Wait a minute. Okay, take this. That comes in right there. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, actually. We can't have a simulacrum of a simulacrum. As soon as we have a simulacrum of a simulacrum, and I mean this literally and physically, in terms of, now we know through quantum mechanics that physics is not necessarily observable in the empirical sense. So what happens when you have a simulacrum of a simulacrum is this goes right back to the speculum. I'm sure you've done this trick or inadvertently been in this situation where you put a mirror against a mirror, and suddenly there seems to be an infinite number of images of yourself going back into this kind of third-dimensional space that doesn't really exist. That's precisely what happens when you have a simulacrum of a simulacrum. It just repeats itself ad infinitum until it hits the horizon, the event horizon, and vanishes. So that one of the great advantages of what motivates us to give up our sovereignty? Why do we toss it overboard? Well, there is the knock at the door, like we had before. There's the knock at the door by the real, the grand alt is at the door, The name of the Father is at the door. The superego wants more. The superego's turning the doorknob, letting it in, because the superego belongs to it, not to you. It's the not I. And so the superego is not, in a way, is brokering your relinquishment, your abdication of your sovereignty. So it lets the real in, the real becomes your sense of I. As a result, you can enjoy all of the wonderful splendors of the mass media. Let me give you an example. I don't know if you like football games on TV, but if you do, and I have the textbooks that have the tables that show this. I teach media courses, and one of my textbooks shows this. How many minutes of play do you, well, a football game is 3 hours. How many minutes of actual play are you watching? Any guesses? In 3 hours. Take a wild, crazy guess.
None.
Thank you. Okay, Andrew. Yeah, sometimes it's 13 minutes, 11 minutes, the same thing. You are actually watching an 11-minute game. Many of you have some good video editing software, and you want to take the game and cut out everything else, which is 50% advertising. 50% advertising. But 11 to 13 minutes of actual play. But for that whole time, you were totally satisfied. You're chugging beers, you're watching the ads, which are always spectacular. You're listening to the critics. You're watching the replays, and you're seeing these 13 minutes of actual play. God forbid you spend a couple $100 on tickets to sit there in the freezing weather to watch this nightmare. But it still takes 3 hours if you sit in the stands. But you have to watch them loitering out on the field, wandering around, looking down at the AstroTurf, because you can't see the other distracting junk. Maybe on the Jumbotron, you can. So we can enjoy that. We don't have to play football. We don't have to play baseball. We don't have to play soccer. We can just watch it on TV. Because in the first negation, we have become the imago. The image has become the real thing. The simulacrum is our experience of reality. And reality is, unfortunately, as you'll see, still there. And it rears its ugly head from time to time in the form of a psychological crisis, or emotional crisis, which we can term a threshold, for instance, or a zone of proximal development, which we'll get to in a minute. So I'll just enumerate these. We have the advantages of the first negation, the negation of the self, the giving up of it. When we become the mirror that was out there, now we are the mirror, and we're totally reflecting the social. We just become a mirror for the social. The advantages are, one, a much better relationship with the superego, because the superego is on their side. It's on the real side. Secondly, we can experience hyperreality as our own reality. We don't have to deal with reality. We can fly through space. We can be football players. We can wear the jersey with somebody's name on the back. NASCAR. Oh my God. Yeah, there are endless examples of this, because this has become our lives. Now, with these, we can take these down into the subway, and we can just stare at them. We can take them to the woods. We don't need a connection to the internet or to the phone system. We can have 16 gigabytes of data on here that we can just shove in our faces and walk around like this. I'm not anti-phone. This is my best friend. I live and die by this device. And it's tax deductible, so I like it even more. So
I've studied most of my Lacan on this thing, seriously.
And I read my biography of Lacan, my mind. So now we have, really what has happened is the scales have tipped. Well, I won't go through every moment of the history of this, but 1449, movable type. the huge rise, the parabolic rise of the Christian discourse takes over. Slowly that's usurped by new media, telegraph, newspapers, lithography, by the way, did away with movable type. In other words, being able to create a metal lithograph, metal plate that you can wrap around a drum and print super fast, completely revolutionized. It made cheap books so that everybody could have a Bible or whatever they wanted, porn or a Bible, a newspaper, any piece of propaganda people could have. And then, the telegraph eventually evolves into some other things, to the radio first, and television, and you know the rest of the story. But all the way up into the 1980s, the scale was not on the simulacrum side, but on the real and the simulation side. We could have the real and we could have the simulation. An example of that is, let's say, the old King Kong and the new King Kong. The old King Kong is claymation. It's a simulation. We have the clay monster is about that big. I've seen pictures of it. And he's manipulated, and you know how that works. But the simulacrum is where we have computer-generated imagery, which is an imitation of the imitation. And so we have a simulacrum. Because the imitation isn't, even the imitation itself isn't an image of a thing that doesn't exist. It is pure imago. There is no King Kong. I'm sorry to tell you. There's no originating King Kong. So now we enter this fantastic world of magical realism. How much better is that? And not only that, but if we don't like something, we can turn it off. I can't turn off reality. But I can stay on this couch and look at this TV and wander around in the so-called real world looking at this and enjoying my simulacrum until, like I said before, the first negation ends in death. So it's the best narcotic ever created. But even that doesn't make it bad. We're not talking about bad and good. We're using only technical terms here. So let me go to the literature. What's the mechanism of this? And when we talk about mechanisms, any of you know about how computers work? Computers work on algorithms. Algorithms are little symbolic machines that do an operation over and over and over. And the operation only changes when there's a conditional branch. But that conditional branch is also predictable. So it's predictably predictable, not predictably unpredictable, like as we talked about last lecture, which Lacan brings up, is stochastic, predictably unpredictable, which really is the ego and the ego. So what does Lacan say? This is from Bakely, my favorite edition of it. By the way, if you have this edition, remember that Lacan himself picked out what's in this book. It isn't it's the abridged Bakely, but it's what he thought should be in it, and it's translated by the translator that he chose, and he did go over the English. So it's a really, really great book. You can get it, 1977. So he says here on page 65 of the lecture, Function and Field of Speech and Language, which is his psycholinguistic manifesto, and it must read. You are not a Lacanian unless you read this. It says, through the word, already a presence made of absence. So remember, we're talking about no one, nobody, being that has no attribute, etc. Absence itself gives itself a name in that moment of origin, whose perpetual recreation Freud's genius detected in the play of the child. Just one example of what Freud meant is, universally children carry a doll or some kind of blanket, an object, and you wonder, why does this child hang on to this thing? Where the child is pushing a toy stroller with a toy baby in it. this is what is called here the perpetual recreation of an imago of the child's self. And this thing that the child's clinging to in behavioral psychology is called the object constancy. Once the child develops a sense of I and then gets to the very beginning of the social stage, then right at that point the child says, wow, there are others, and I need these others. And sometimes these others go away. And what does that mean? Where do they go? Will they ever come back? And then the child cries. So this object constancy problem is alleviated by the clinging on to an object, which is the simulacrum of the objective character in the child's life, which doesn't really exist. If it really exists, then gender would matter. Mom would have to be female. Dad would have to be male. The name of the father would have to always be attributed to the father. But we're just talking about psychological structures here that have nothing to do with these names. It's the name of the father. I said the most important aspect of the phrase, the name of the father, is not the father. It's the name of, the name of. And that's what he's talking about, how the name of creates these things. And from this pair of sounds, modulated on presence and absence, a coupling that the tracing in the sand of the single and the broken line of the mantic qua of China would also serve to constitute, there is born the world of meaning of a particular language in which the world of things will come to be arranged. So let's say that word, the bad word, Heidegger. Let's put the whole Dasein being issue to rest. In psycholinguistics, both in the work of the father of psycholinguistics, Jacob Cantor, and in his objective psychology of grammar, which we'll hear from in a minute, and in Lacan, all this comes to being because of the word. So, and which, by the way, is in direct opposition to Saussure. Direct opposition. And I should know, I'm a Ferdinand de Saussure fellow at the European Graduate School. I'm supposed to be his representative here on earth, like Jesus was with God. So he says further that through that which becomes embodied only by being, the trace of a nothingness, and whose support cannot thereafter be impaired, the concept, having the duration of what passes, engenders the thing, das Ding. Lacan preferred to use the German phrase das Ding because that made it more technical, made it a nomenclature jargon, if you will. But here he says the thing. I don't think he got to das Ding stage when he gave this lecture. So, but he had this concept, which is critical and absolutely critical in Jacob Cantor's work, the father of psycholinguistics, the parent. I'm trying to get the gender out of it. The parent of psycholinguistics. So, he goes, for it is, and here's really the key part of this quote, for it is still not enough to say that the concept is the thing itself, as any child can demonstrate against the pedant. It is the world of words that creates the world of things. I'll read that one more time. It is the world of words that creates the world of things. So the devenir, the coming into being, is entirely dependent upon the naming of things. So when we say the name of the father, there is no father. There's no objective father. There's no gendered character in the child's life. It's just the name. Father becomes the representative of all that structure, which eventually becomes a grand autre. So he goes on further. The things originally confused in the hic et nunc, we don't know what this means of the here and now, of the all in the process of coming into being. And here's where Lacan is using what I would call Lacanian grammar. This is a great translation, so that's not the problem. Okay, I'll read that again. The things originally confused in the hic et nunc of all in the process of coming into being, the devenir, by giving its concrete being to their essence and its ubiquity to what has always been. Its ubiquity to what has always been. Well, what has always been is a priori you. It's because it's absolutely, we know that it's always been. So that means that it's a priori you, and you're a posteriori what has always been. So what all has always been is truly objective. So here we are, and here we discover the part of the world that is reality. It's what has always been and always will be, because something can't always have been unless it always will be. The laws of the universe. So now the conflict is not between the inner self and the alienated self. It's not a conflict between the inner self and the alienated self, but between the I, the first negation, the first negation, and the world. It becomes a conflict between the abducted self, the first negation, and this reality that has always been. Now, let's see. John says reality is a montage of the symbolic and imaginary. Yes, that quote is somewhat decontextualized because I don't want to see the whole context, but it's somewhat decontextualized because we have to think of what is reality as the simulacrum, which is the social, which is now being reflected in us. We are now the mirror. It is no longer the mirror where we see ourselves. So,
and we're going to talk more about this when we're going to talk about Brahmi God in the next class.
Okay, so I think it's time to wrap this up.
Yeah, if there are any questions.
I'm going to do 5 more minutes because I really have to do the end of this. And so let me just put on one more image, and then I'll wrap it up. Because what we've been talking about, just to reiterate, is what happens after the first negation. Why do we do it? What motivates us to abdicate? What motivates us to be abducted? All those wonderful things that are described in Umberto Eco's Adventures in Hyperreality. Buy it, get it. Probably get it for $2 on Amazon. But I just want to look at one more diagram, and then I'm out of here. Yeah, I just want to get to the full screen button. How's that look? Do you see the whole thing?
You can tell us, but we don't see the chat.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I could. The whole thing's there.
Oh, the whole
okay.
thing's there.
Then let me just go back.
Well, now it's blinking on the second page, but you just had it.
Okay.
We saw
all
it.
right.
Thank you.
Yep. There.
All right. This is sort of an abstract from a long answer I gave to John's, Doug's question on the Facebook page about the relationship between n+1 and Russell's paradox. And the reason why I'm bringing this up right now is because that's what we're going to dive into the next lecture. So let me put these ideas in your head, and then I'll go and relate them to what we're talking about. What's really important here, n+1 is thrown around, it's been fetishized. And this is a problem, because it's lost its meaning. It's become a metaphor, but it is not a metaphor. It is and I hate to reuse the word reality because we're using it in a technical sense. It is a structure that indicates a movement. It is not a metaphor. However, in the system that we're talking about here, the development Lacanian thought. Really, what we should be considering is the 0 plus n, which in abduction topology is the categorical exclusion. When something comes into being because of the word, because of the name, as we were just hearing from Lacan himself. So really what we should be concerned about is the step from 0 to n. So plus n means that we can create any integer for infinity by this simple algorithm. It's a kind of algorithm. If I take 0 and I add n to it, then I can get any integer, which is of course true of n plus 1. So let's look at these two things. The 0 plus n is the coming into being. So in the expanded structure of the mirror stage, that's the 0i to the i1. Then when we look at Peano's axiom, and Peano's 3 axioms are that 0 is a number that all numbers follow themselves, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that no number can, all numbers follow the previous number, and that no number can follow itself. So you can't have 2 after 2. But the one we're concerned about is the second axiom, which says that all numbers are followed by the next number, never by itself. So that's n plus 1. And that's it. We don't need to ever look at another number. This goes on for infinity. So we have an infinite amount of possibilities in when we go from 0i to i1 to i2. Because in I2, why do we have an infinite number of possibilities? The reason is because in the first negation, we have relinquished our sovereignty, which we'll also talk about next class. We've relinquished our sovereignty, and we have been abducted. We are now the mirror of the social, and the social can be whatever it wants. So we can be a football player, we can fly through space, we can have sex and porn. Porn is, by the way, probably the absolute best example of life in the simulacrum. So then we get to the Russell's paradox, and I'll leave it at that. The rest of this we've already talked about in the previous lecture. So you see that little symbolic diagram there, xn, negation xn. So Russell's paradox is the set of all sets is a set of itself if and only if it is not a set of itself. The set of all sets is a set of itself if and only if it is not a set of itself. And if you think about it later, you'll see that that has to be true in a logical sense. But this is not just playing with words. So what we're looking at here is X is the set of all sets. And N is the set of itself. And we have the negation of it. So it can only exist, X and N can only exist in negation. So it comes into being and out of being. But the issue here is not that we have one thing and another thing at a different time. Because really, we're talking about the quantum mechanics, not as a metaphor. So what we have here are two states. We have the set of all sets that is, and the set of all sets that is not. And you cannot have one without the other. So in the first negation, what's happening is that we're going from, on the left side of this algebraic formula, or algebraic expression of Russell's paradox, we have the sense of I, along with the shell of the superego, or the alienated self. And on the right, we have the negation of that in the form of the first negation, Hegel's first negation. Notice that one cannot exist without the other. It's a critical concept, and it's really, really hard to grasp eventually. But these things work in simultaneous parallel ontologies. In other words, once the first negation has occurred, actually you are living two lives simultaneously. And this is the fascinating thing about the first negation.
Can we just get many charms? Apart from this, if we want to think about Lacan's counting till 4, because this is basically what it is, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, x. The non-being could be perceived as a discourse of the analyst coming from object A position. the ideal I can be perceived as the hysterics discourse. Real I as the universe. Can you type in this?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, real I as the universe's objectivist discourse, and then abducted I as a master's discourse.
I think that's an accurate interpretation of all of this. So let's get out of this, and then I'll just say my last words. And there's those. Okay.
It's just
yeah. Okay. So I'm going to make an assumption here that we've all passed the threshold of the first negation. That we are now reflecting the social. What I want you to do for the next week, this is your homework, is think about, try to identify. It's really hard, but once you do it, it's a liberating feeling. Try to see if you are living two different lives. That you have the life of your sovereignty, and that which you still possess, and simultaneously the life of the sovereignty that you have abdicated.
We don't take any responsibility for clinical consequences.
Yes. As there was a story about the Buddha. An acolyte came to the Buddha and said, "Why do you make us go through all of these lessons in Buddhism and all of this practice to become enlightened? Why don't you just tell us what we need to know right now and enlighten us?" The Buddha says, "If I told you that right now, you would die of fright. So don't die of fright." Questions?
Yay, our fright. The fright is the subject, really, because we've been missing out anxiety and fright in all this conversation. I mean, it's, I think, central to the human experience of...
Well, by the way, to make this a little more concrete and clinical, this simultaneous parallel ontology, which is described in great detail in abduction topology, is the source of something new. We have pushed the guilt behind us because now we've done what the superego wants us to do. We've become good Catholics. But we're still a child that doesn't want to be a Catholic. And we're Catholics, and those two things are coexisting. And as a result, it creates depression and anxiety and conflict.
Right.
The clinical symptoms. All right, so we have a long, what looks like a long question here. So let's...
Oh, this is Andrew.
Okay, Andrew. Obviously, there's no, this is what Andrew says, obviously there's no turning back from the imposition of the apparatus of language once it's been imposed. First negation. But does this conception of language rule out the possibility of speech acts before language, or rather rule out an origin of language story that involves only the use of tools of communication without scope of communication, or would those very communicative acts, i.e. pointing out or signifying some tool and showing its purpose through use, count as a naming? Question one. No. The answer is that all we're talking about here is spoken language, or what Saussure describes as parole. Parole.
There is a concept that Lacan developed of the langue that precedes the symbolized language.
Well, unfortunately, he didn't develop it. In 1900, that's
right.
A course in general linguistics by Saussure, and his two principles of language are langue and parole. So langue is what you know as language, the grammar, the individual words, the alphabet, the syntax, and the other part is the actual what you're listening to now that's coming out of my mouth. But to get back to Andrew's question, we're not talking about tools here. We're not talking about unspoken language. Linguistics, you're talking about psycholinguistics. And psycholinguistics is not about written language. Written language is, Lacan doesn't even talk about it. So it's really not part of this discussion. And at the very end, there's another question. In asking this question, I have to fall back on concepts that set the limit of language. But the question is in the spirit of, well, can there be a purely conceptual internal language that precedes these limitations? I.e., Is it naming or use that traps us in language, and is there a substantial difference? All right, I'm going to make an assumption here. Let's go back to Noam Chomsky and universal grammar, UG, UG. UG is an appropriate name for it because what the innatists say in linguistics is that we are born with the what's called the language faculty. The language faculty is what I think would be called here a language that precedes these limitations. So it is a kind of language, and we might say that it's very closely related to Proto-Indo-European, but not really, because any kind of language that has tahol that can come out of my mouth that's actually really satisfies all the requirements of long is once again the discourse. And so once it becomes the discourse, something comes into being, it's debonair. When something comes into being, it has no attributes.
So in terms of Lacan's teaching itself, he talks about the possibility of meta-language a lot, and he just develops topology of structures to develop our conversation into something that is going to allow us to communicate these ideas without getting caught up in the narrative structure.
But yes, Andrew, if we take the innatist point of view, I can't say that this is so. It's just a theory. If we take the innatist point of view, then we have to admit that we are born with an unspoken language that is not the discourse. And that is really significant in the development of the very first to categorical, when we were going from the categorical exclusion from 0i to I1. As soon as we get to I1, then it is the beginning of the apparatus. The apparatus. Once it becomes the apparatus, it becomes long. And as an extension of long, because we must make noise to be understood, we need a medium, which is air in this situation, then we are immediately in the discourse. Once the discourse starts, the inevitable pathway of it, which gets back to the very beginning of your question, Andrew, you said, no turning back. There's no turning back. Once you're in the apparatus, once your arm gets caught in that apparatus, it drags you all the way through to the first negation and dumps you out on the other side. And at that point, you have one interesting choice, which I'll talk about next time.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I think we're going to take the other questions on our Facebook page and through other means. If you want to copy, here's Preston.
Thank you. Hey, we're all set. Thank you so much. And next week we'll have the penultimate class, or is that the number class session 4, right?
Yeah, and then we have also one discussion class.
Great. Fantastic. Okay, thank you all very much, and have a great Sunday evening.
You too.
Thank you guys for being here.
Okay, bye.